Welcome everyone. My name is Caroline Wright. I'm the marketing manager for CCG. I'm going to be your moderator today. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. A few housekeeping things before we get started. All of your lines will remain muted throughout the webinar. We are going to reserve some time for Q&A session at the end of the webinar, so please submit your questions via the chat window at any time and we will address them at the end. This webinar is being recorded and the recording and slides will be available to you after the webinar. Before we get started, let me introduce you quickly to our two webinar speakers, Aaron Hart and Carolyn Egan. Aaron Hart is a solution architect at CCG. He's here based out of Tampa, Florida. Aaron has contributed to the creation of a national data infrastructure that enables consistent collection and reporting of key performance metrics for all students in all institutions, essential for higher education systems. Aaron and CCG help identify a best practice approach to resolve challenges in the education sector. He has over 10 years of experience in the education field and projects for Department of Information and Innovation, DII, and Agency of Education, AOE. Aaron has served as an expert advisor to education committees in Washington, D.C., and served as an advisor with the Common Education Data Standards Project. Carolyn Egan is our other presenter today. Carolyn is the education lead for CCG, also here out of Tampa, Florida. Carolyn helps identify a best practice approach to BI and data warehousing solution architecture to resolve complex challenges through advanced analytics. Her background is in education marketing, admissions, recruiting, data analytics, alumni engagement, and student retention. She has over 20 years of professional experience in leadership development, college administration, recruitment, coaching, training, and leading top-performing teams throughout the United States. I'll now pass it over to Carolyn to get things started.
I have the immense pleasure to work with numerous students throughout my career, and one student that stands out the most, that I'll never forget, is Jasmine. When I had the opportunity to meet Jasmine for her first college interview, this was quite some time ago in Arizona, she was a high school graduate, just out of high school. She was applying for the Bachelor's in Human Services. She desperately wanted to work and make a difference with folks in her community. Being a young student straight out of high school, the college that she was applying for, the institution I was working for at the time, it didn't seem to me, as an advisor, the traditional student experience for her. I just didn't feel like it was going to suit her, just from my personal perception. So what I did was I advised her to maybe consider community college for her first 2 years, and even consider working maybe across the street at the Bank of America or some sort of retail branch that did some tuition reimbursement, because tuition is expensive. And I didn't want to deflate her. I didn't want to not encourage her to go to college. But I felt that there was a higher risk for her to start school and not have the right experience and not be the best fit for her than for her to drop out and have debt. And that was just a judgment call. And I didn't often do that with every student because I wanted to give students the best foot forward. And when I said I didn't give that to every student, that wasn't my judgment. She still had the opportunity to apply. But she didn't that day. Her parents and her decided to go back home, think about it, and they would come back to that next week. So time had passed. I'd say about 2 years later, I caught up with her on campus. I saw her walking by the office, and I walked out, and I was like, Jasmine, it's so great to see you. How long have you been here at this school? She said this was her 3rd year. She did go to the community college. She got a year under her belt. She did end up working at another retail branch that did do tuition reimbursement. And even better, she started working at the university there on campus in the bookstore to help defer some of the cost of her tuition. And she was in her 3rd year of her human services degree. I'm just so glad, and ultimately, she was the first generation to go to college and an English as a second language student as well. The good news is the U.S. retention rate is increasing by 2%. Since 2007, Florida's has increased about 5% over time, literally over the past, since 2007, the past decade. So it's a little slow. So what we're considering today is reframing the current decision-making model by bringing more data together to find more Jasmines and help get them to student success. So let's reframe the problem and let's look at today's agenda.
Let's move on.
We're going to go over some scope of the problem. We're going to go over the retention rate in higher education. We're going to consider student drop retention analytics in an example that we've done and some analysis we've done. Then we're going to move into having Erin go over some solution overviews, what it is, how does it work, how has he made it work, some external and internal ways you can manipulate that, and how long would it take you to do this? Is it going to be a long, drawn-out process for your campus or for your school? So some expectations and outputs. And we'll also have some time for questions and answers, and then any next steps that we could help you with. So let's consider our university's case study overview, what we've done, what we've experienced, what we've seen, and we've taken some sample collections. So our university case overview, we took a college test university that consisted over 18 colleges, schools, that offered over 175 programs in the study and had more than 250 majors. A lot of different students, snowflakes in the mix, right? Different decision making thoughts, and with enrollment over 28,000 students, with an overall alumni of 145,000. To consider the student retention, some schools, and this particular school had created an Office of Undergraduate Student Success to improve their student retention rate, which was currently at 72% of students that were making it past their freshman year within the university. That was the retention rate, which the national average is hovering around 69.4%. So putting that into perspective, taking a look at the top-down approach in this sample and drill down into the schools, or to that, and to different schools, and comparing that degree level information, even considering, we're not going to go into this depth of detail, but considering the courses, the schedule, the reality of schedules, coming in their first year, trying to get students to apply and enroll and get them into the right seat on the bus and the right track at the beginning, I know it's challenging. I've been there. It's very difficult. You want to get the student in. The longer it takes them to get started, typically the longer it'll take them to graduate. We know how that can end. The numbers are reflected there, considering GPAs and first-class examples. So with that, let's look at how that ended up, those benchmarks from this case study.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. Let's take a look at the graduation benchmarks. Here you're seeing typical on the left at four-year universities, that's all four universities, and then the test universities. So we can tell here that we have a graduation rate, 6-year graduation rate, which is less than the comparative universities that we have. So, you know, there's an opportunity here for improvement on graduation, and part of that is through retention, and we can display that, we can measure that, we can take a look at that. One of the things I wanted to bring to everyone today was iPads. And for those who are familiar with it and are responsible for submitting those data 3 times a year, the National Center for Education Statistics creates and collects the integrated post-secondary data sets. So they're collecting information from all universities where the students are receiving Pell Grants or where there's federal aid, and it is compulsory that the institutions provide those data 3 times a year. A lot of folks don't understand or follow the data as the National Center for Education Statistics actually works with it. So one of the things I'm going to show you here quickly is, you know, what we've done with that data that's come through. Here's a simple graph we're showing for our institutions. So here we go. I'm going to bring up that graduation rate. Okay. So now, the 6-year graduation rate for freshmen entering fall 2007, and these are based on the selections on the right. This is interactive. So I'm able to go through and pick public institutions. And this is down here, the disclaimer is the source of this data is the National Center for Education Statistics 2014, and it's based on the IPEDS data that was submitted by the colleges and universities. So these are data that were collected from over 6,000 post-secondary institutions across the country 3 times a year. and the National Center for Education Statistics brings this data together to create these high-level statistics. A lot of what you see in USA Today, a lot of what you see in published articles talking about graduation, talking about retention, talking about outcomes is really driven by these federal data. And so we're going to show today not only how we've used that federal data, but also the tools that are available for you to use that data as well. Keeping in mind this data is external to your university, but how do you obtain data about other universities that are in your same sector or in your same Carnegie classification if you wish to measure yourself within the market? So let me go back here.
Thank you, Erin, for sharing that. It might be new information for some of these folks of this particular website. It's an enormously helpful resource. You are an expert and help build out those the data standard sets. In addition, looking at this particular sample university's 1% opportunity. So with that said.
Right. So let's move on to our next slide. With that said,
what if you could predict your student success rate? Erin, what do you think we would do with that information? What type of technologies could you offer your students and different resources you could offer your students or additional resources at the campus? I remember in my role in senior executive level and sitting on the executive committee, if we had that additional resources and funds, we could offer so many different student experiences to build and grow our
correct. I generally found with working with post-secondary institutions that there are a number of programs and resources that are in place that are put there to assist students in setting their goals, maintaining and improving their academic performance, and in some cases it's simply identifying those students who would be at risk and connecting them with the appropriate resources. So in a number of instances where I've worked, the programs were in place, but they just weren't being applied to the correct population. And once we were able to align that population at risk with those programs, we saw a measured improvement in those students over time. And these were some limited studies that were funded by some philanthropic organizations, Bill and Melinda Gates, Michael and Susan Dell. There's a number of organizations that are looking to improve student improvement, improve outcomes, and that's one of the positives, I think, is that private influx of money.
Well, Erin, let's take a quick poll. What is our audience today on the webinar? What would you do with this information? So it looks like 80% of our audience today would change your at-risk student approach, more of a proactive approach. Perfect. Then what we're going to go through, and Erin's going to be sharing with you, is exactly that. And interesting poll. So the proactive approach. I find that we have been really good at the reactive, and we're really good at putting out fires on campuses and student issues. But let's look at the proactive approach.
Okay. So here's an example of a university's 1% opportunity, and you'll notice that we are very generic. We're not talking about a specific university. As a matter of fact, this particular university, we may have manipulated the data to be able to present what we wanted to today. Obviously, working with student level data requires FERPA and requires some other classifications on that. So in this particular example, we're talking about 1% less in attrition, netting 10 more students as sophomores, and clause back should be in quotations, but really that's significant. That's $270,000 approximately in lost sophomore tuition and fees. And obviously, if these sophomores, if these students who are leaving, and stop outs, stay outs, transfers, that's also going to have an impact on graduation. So I think that's why we're kind of tying these things so closely together: retention, graduation, and outcomes. There's other aspects that we'll talk about just on some of the data sets around Department of Workforce and Labor. There's a lot of organizations who can be partners when you're looking to develop a solution like this. I'm actually going to highlight some of them today. They're free resources, they're voluntary resources, but there's a lot of folks out there that are interested in helping you identify and solve this problem using technology and then applying the right programs and resources within your organization. So let's take a look. So that was at 1%. But if we look over here at this university's opportunity, we're seeing that with an attrition rate of 28%, that's 280 students. And with an average tuition of $26,910, that total loss, or that total opportunity, we were talking about recovering 270,000 of that, but that total opportunity is upwards of $7.5 million for the life
of the students' experience at that college. And moreover, it's the 280 lives that are affected, or not on, maybe at the beginning not on the right college path, or didn't have the resources that they needed, or didn't know they didn't have the right resources. And it's definitely that proactive approach. If we could impact 1% of that, what a difference it would make. But I'm looking to hopefully, my personal quest potentially to increase that to that 2 to 5% increase over 10 years to a significant. Let's get it in the double digits. So.
Yeah,
great.
And we also, we all know that in today's global economy, workers are more mobile. They go to where the jobs are, and there's been a number of studies done that say that we're losing our highly skilled workers because we just don't have the jobs here. We don't have the economy to support that. And while other countries around the world, especially in Asia, folks have looked at the latest PISA and looked at STEM, far more engineers are being produced in East Asia than are being produced in the United States currently. And that's a train traveling down the tracks that, if we don't stop it or slow it down, is going to be a problem. And it's going to endanger, our economy as well. I read a study recently where in the developing countries, interestingly, by 2020 there'll be 45 million high-tech jobs that are not being filled in those developing countries because they don't have the educated workforce to fill that. So we're talking about opportunities. I know folks talk about, individuals coming into our country to take advantage of our educational system, staying and working. But what we're finding increasingly is that foreign students are taking those skills back to their countries where they're needed. And that it opens opportunities for our learners, for our students as well, to fill those jobs. If, it's global economy, you go where the jobs are, right? So I wanted to just bring up here's that opportunity, but I just wanted to show again that iPads data and how that's being reflected. So let me just freeze this.
And I agree to your point. I sit on a few committees here in the state of Florida on workforce development and our skills gap, and you're right in line. Just thinking, and oftentimes it's budgetary issues, but if we could, utilize proactive approach, keep students in there, keep them engaged, keep them on track, especially at-risk students, because it's preparing them for the expectations and competitive and highly skilled and trained needs in our workforce that they're just, quite frankly, some of them most aren't prepared for straight out of high school. So it's leveraging that and partnering that and having that data. And many of the K-12 schools, there's the data sets that you've worked on that have access to, that colleges can have access to be able to see what that pool looks like, so they can see how many applications students are from a particular school district, go look at their success rates or where they're at in those assessments, and then make proactive decisions on how they're going to staff their sophomore classes and instructors and even recruit for those faculty. So there's a big picture piece here too.
And it's great that, you know, Carolyn and I are both on this discussion. I've worked on the ed tech side, so, you know, the technology, in the technology space of, you know, we have a need or we'd like to explore this problem, and really the same discussions that we're having back and forth, and we can, you know, and later on in the presentation we'll talk about how, you know, we typically engage like that, but these are the types of discussions to be had. We know, you know, from an IT perspective, if we build it, they will come. That's not reality. We need to support the business. We need to be reactive, responsive, and we need to see further, go faster, you know, in terms of identifying these challenges and then hopefully creating some remediation. I was recently at a client who stated, you know, what we can measure, we can change. And they set about looking at everything, every aspect of their business that they could measure, and then did analytics to determine where that change provided them with the highest level of return on that investment. So here, what I have in front of you is just a tuition net scatter. This is 2012, and this is showing the percentage of freshmen with Pell. So all the universities are represented. You can see down here it's broken out by region, but we can pick a university where New Rochelle, for example, I'm not picking on any particular university, but here Mid-Atlantic, their Carnegie profile is high undergraduate, which is really for the focus of what we're looking at. Average freshman net revenue is $27,000 off of a tuition and fees of $30,000. But one of the key things here to look at is the percentage of freshmen with Pell Grants, which is 89%. So, you know, we know that a large number of undergraduates who are attending with a high level of financing, potentially debt, you know, going into that. And, you know, as we get further up here, you know, we can look at another institution where, you know, here's Pitzer, far west, exclusively undergraduate, and their revenue is $34,312 off tuition fee of $43. But we only have 10% of the freshmen with Pell Grants, which means that the majority of that's probably funded in other areas. And that's the reason I mentioned Pell Grants is when we talk about IPEDS data, IPEDS is compulsory for those institutions who are receiving, have students who are receiving or eligible for Pell Grants. So as you can see, this is interactive, and also, you know, the disclaimer here again is this is from the IPEDS data. This is the data that was uploaded by your institution and was integrated and analyzed by the National Center for Education Statistics. And this data, I'll show you that this data is available to you. There's some really great tools that they provide. Obviously, you know, you're working with a aggregated data set rather than working with individual student data, but we're going to get to the point of where I give you kind of the laundry list of what we would need internally to be able to build some of these models. So let me switch back to the presentation. Okay, so we're back and I am on air. Okay, so what's a retention model? Really what we're doing is we're taking a look at what our students' performance has been in the past. So we're looking at the data that shows how our 2007 fall cohort first-time entry is following towards meeting their successful goals of obtaining a four-year degree. A lot of steps. This is actually happens to be IBM's churn prediction stream, and for those of you who are familiar with marketing, you know, the churn model is, you know, fairly well defined in retaining customers. In this case, our customer is the student. So this is showing an example of how we build that retention model once we have those data, once we've built that understanding, and we can start bringing those elements in, and we can be looking at what possible, and I say possible, correlations there are between certain behaviors and elements and a student's ability to succeed. So let's go here. So how does it work? Before we can get to the step where we're doing data mining and building analytical models, we really have to prepare that student historical data for modeling. It falls into some general categories, however, there's some more. So application, financial, academic, completions, exit surveys. Today, social media is also huge as well. So, you know, what's the buzz on social media about the school? Is the class hard? You know, is university life great? I remember a study years ago that someone did of, you know, what are the most fun colleges to go to? And we have to imagine that that does factor into a student's decision, as well as academics. And I think Carolyn will talk a little bit more about that as well, about how students are making their decisions to pursue a degree and where they're attending school. The second step is to determine to identify historical data for a student who's dropped. So we want to look at the students who were not successful. And that falls into a number of areas that I've worked with over the years and have grown. So we have academic preparedness, which is really looking at that student's application, the work and the rigor that went into their high school career, time. So, you know, were they adequately prepared? Were they taking AP courses? Were they taking advanced math courses? What did they do to prepare for where their goals should be? Demographics. I'm not going to go too much into demographics. I spent a lot of time with No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top. I work with the SSA. I do a lot of K-12 work as well. We do know that there are some statistically underserved or underperforming groups based on demographics. A little more contentious than I want to get into today, but that's something you want to look at as well. I mean, if you have one group or another that is performing lower than their peers, you know, that may be something that you want to include into your churn model. Just saying. Then, you know, once we've gotten past that, we get into ambivalence, and that's really when, you know, the student is at the institution. So we're looking at late matriculated students. So if the student's, you know, 24 years old, it's their first entry into school, or they come in and they have a high number of developmental courses. They're really not as adequately prepared for what their expectations are within the institution. So let's go through. In the interest of time, I probably could go much deeper into that. But there's a lot of different data elements, or a lot of different categories that we look at to measure that. So then we're going to leverage those statistics to determine how modeled student attributes correlate to dropping. That's exactly, you know, here's the things we think, but let's take a look and see if they actually are real. I was told in Washington one time, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. Just because you can do analysis and come up with some really crazy correlations, you know, they may not be true, they may not be correct, you know. So we try to stay out of those. We use those statistics to build a test model on the historical data. So we're going to run it for a particular cohort. We're going to identify those students who are at risk, and then we're going to test that against a different cohort who we have a known outcome to test that model, to see if we really did identify the same drop, you know, from 2007 class to 2008 cohort, you know, did we get it? And we're going to repeat those steps until we find a model that's reliable. And one of the things, and we'll talk about it before, just because today, say, academic preparedness was serious for the class of, you know, the cohort of 2007, you know, those realities could change. And especially we start working on college and career readiness, especially when we start talking about more programs in the high school level and college feedback reports to the high school so that these students who graduate are better prepared. Ironically, the U.S. graduation rate has been steadily increasing, but are those students adequately prepared for college? That's another discussion for another webinar. So what do we need? In this example, I've pulled a few things. I mean, there are many. But this is an example of what we would do. So we have, historical performance, which I talked about, grade point averages, semesters. So this is really a conglomeration of those things I talked about: academic preparedness, demographics, ambivalence, effort, strategy, and then of course academic warnings as well, academic standing. So there's a lot of different pieces, and that's where it becomes a little challenging to bring all of those data together to be able to do that data mining. All right, so let's jump ahead. All right, so I know I'm kind of moving quickly through this, and I know as we go through we can have, we can talk about it, we can have some questions of really how to engage in this. And Carolyn and I really are having those discussions. One, me being from EdTech, and in the Jasmine example, Carolyn identified a student who needed additional help, or there was a concern, and help the student. But the chances of just running across an individual student, or, it would be much better if that discussion was precipitated by Carolyn knowing that these particular students, not just Jasmine, but a handful of students who were not prepared, or, had some unrealistic goals towards reaching their degrees. So we'll just go through this really quick. This is kind of how we engage. It's how to engage successfully. You want to elicit, you want to find out what, is this an issue? And so my suggestion to folks who want to affect retention, who want to build data models, is to talk within their organization. Use the iPEDS data that's already out there, that's already in a format that you have the ability to manipulate, a lot of dashboards. It's easy. You put the presentation together. This is what our retention rate is, based on our tuition, this is what we're losing, and, how do we identify the programs, identify the students, and move that forward. Then you're going to analyze those data. You're going to take a look at what data you have access to. I know from my own personal experience that these data live in silos. I've worked with Banner. I don't know how many folks on the phone have an SIS system like Banner, but most do, an ERP. But there's a lot of institutions that have many different systems, many different silos, and many different levels of security. And so identifying what you can have access to, what you should have access to, and also realizing that some of this data, when it's brought together, really does present, a security risk, for an individual based on FERPA. So we can't forget that. Modeling. Really, at this point, we've discovered the problem. We're going to look at retention. We've analyzed it. We've identified the systems. Now we start building the models. And there's a lot that goes into that, from a data completeness and a data quality aspect, and many different systems. So typically the organizations that I work with are doing a kind of a phased approach. They work with the systems that they have access to and gain momentum and present that, and then they're able to incorporate other systems. Like I said, social media, other things that would factor into this. But they're generally not, those are generally not your first targets. Your first targets are really your student information system, financial aid, and academic. And then really at the end, we're verifying and validating that. So we're really coming back and saying, do we think that this model meets the needs? Is it identifying the students that we want to reach out to? And then making our policies and our different offices within the Department of Education aware so that they can provide those resources and hopefully some remediation, for those students. One of the things I do want to talk about quick about modeling and takeaways is the fact that I did encounter a situation in working with a post-secondary institution in the Northeast. And one thing they told me was that, most students, drop out after their first semester. And we said, really? And, it's huge. I think it was 28% in the example that we had looked at, first semester, 28%. We talked about why that was. And there's a lot of different factors. But one of the things they brought up, too, was emotional intelligence of the student. They had a student who came, he was on campus housing, doing great, meeting all of the requirements, on track, comes home on Christmas, doesn't want to go back. And his parents asked him why he didn't want to go back to school, and he said, I have to share a bathroom with other people. Now, we're looking at this model, we're looking at, analyzing. Those aren't things that we could have predicted. There's some surveys, but I don't think we're going to, ask those types of questions. But the pre-entry, the application survey, a lot of organizations are putting questions that help you identify the emotion, some emotional intelligence of the student. So just, the leading question asks, do you plan to work? How many hours are you planning to work? There's some questions that can be asked on surveys that we can extrapolate some of the emotional intelligence from. But generally, there's, like I said, what we can measure, we can change. We're working on measuring that right now. There's a lot of work being done in behavioral sciences and emotional intelligence work. They're actually offering classes now to help individuals measure and increase their emotional intelligence to prepare them for post-secondary, because even though they're academically prepared, they may not be emotionally prepared or ready for that. So, Carolyn, do you have any? I've been monopolizing the the presentation, and before I get into some of the resources and some of the things that are out there to assist and to help you identify and build these programs, I just wanted to bring it back to you and see if there's anything you'd like to add.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. Well, to your point on engaging and what you're wanting to look at, it specifically to a new approach to at-risk students. If I were to put Jasmine on a piece of paper without identifying information, there might be trigger points that could have that validated what she did and how she would be successful in that suggestion. Whereas if I said this same advice or gave the same route or checklist to go off and here's your marching orders to your path to success to your goals, the outcome might not have been the same. And so to be able to identify that early on is key to really impact that 28%. And it's really project management, how you engage on those projects. And it's not easy. I know, working with academics, with admissions, with career services, student services, financial aid, accounting, IT, all those are very oftentimes big. In large institutions, like the sample we had given of 100 or 280 schools, I think that was, or programs. I mean, there's a lot of moving parts, so by no means is it easy. But if you can start off with phase one conversation, and bring it to your executive committee or your provost or your president, that's where it all starts, is to really just kind of look at things different, ask different questions, and pull in some data, external data. So I agree.
Right. So let's. I mean, that's a great segue. Let's go take a look at some of that external data quick. So let me jump to the next slide. These are the folks here, and I know Carolyn talked about takeaways, and these are the institutions that I've worked with that work with post-secondary data. And these, when you read the articles in USA Today, when you read the research studies, when you see the things that are coming out of Washington, this is where those data are coming from, and it's being provided by universities and colleges. So this data is being provided, it's being collected. In some cases of iPads, it's mandatory. National Student Clearinghouse, again, they're also collecting data. They're providing persistence and retention data. The government, which an underutilized data resource in my opinion, because they do collect data not only about post-secondary, but this is economic data. This is talking about economic growth, the jobs, the projections, the skills. All that information is there. It's free. Well, free is relative. We paid for it, but it's free to us now. Public Insight. So everything I've listed here for these top 4, those are all websites that you have access to where you can take that data, you can bring those data down locally, and you can do the types of things like I showed you with Tableau earlier. But one thing now I want to switch over to is iPads specifically, because this really is that post-secondary, this is the analysis that they're doing with the post-secondary data. So in the interest of time, I'll just pop over there quick and I'll just show you an example, and then we can come back. But again, all these links are here. They're part of the presentation. If you click on them, they're focused on education or persistence, the things we talked about today. To help you. And then a plug for the last 2, post-secondary, the P20 Education Standards Council, which I've had the privilege of working with and speaking with and presenting with in Washington. And as they mentioned in the beginning, the Common Education Data Standards, here's my disclaimer, it has nothing to do with Common Core. It's nothing like that. What this is a glossary that's been created of all the post-secondary elements. It's been grouped by use cases. It is a shopping list. If you want to look at retention, if you want to look at college career readiness, labor, NAICS codes, I mean, everything you can possibly think of, this data has been identified, it's been defined, the elements have been categorized, data typed, so it's a great place to start. Identifying things, especially if you're building a case for a program. So let me just switch to iPads quick. All right, shows I'm paused. I'm back on air. Okay, so what you're looking at here is iPads, and this is their data center. This is where those data land, and there's something really neat and new. I think when I showed Carolyn, I mean, it was new, and she's been in this, she's been in this space for a long time. They have a trend generator, which is really cool. So this is all the data that's brought in. We go to post-secondary institution. We can look at graduation and retention rates. They've got some canned questions. So, what's the full-time retention rate in post-secondary institutions? Brings my trend up. I can go in. I can limit it. So I can look at a particular state. I'm not going to pick on anybody, but since we're in Florida, I'm going to Florida. So here the retention is 76%. So, we can go over here, we can look at the trend. So here's the trend, here's the full-time retention rate in post-secondary institutions by state. So, wow, we've done well over the past, 6 years, 7 years. You can see that we're trending up. There's still room for growth, there always is, but this gives you a way to access this data. If you want to download this data into Excel, it's there, it's available. You can pull it down, you can integrate it, you can build your own, own analytics on it. We have trends. Oops, sorry, that's the last one. We can go to build the table, and then when we build the table, we can actually go in and look specifically and say, well, we want to look at a particular geographic region, and then we're able to pull it up. So for this area, 76%. So there's numerous help available for these. iPads has a lot of folks that are willing to help you work through this, and this is a big change. I just wanted to show, from the past. If you go to the iPad site, which I hope you're seeing, but if you go to the iPad site, you can go to use the data. So here you're looking at iPads, and this is the data center. So you have data trends. You can look up an institution, data feedback reports, statistical tables, which it will allow you and build and download, and you can really integrate this into your process. But what I found is this really is the gateway, right? A lot of institutions start here. They take these data, they create a program that says this is where our retention is, this is where we rate against the institutions we choose to benchmark against, and what resources and what programs do we want to put in place to increase this, and along with the value proposition, you can really put a number. It's helping students. I'm always about increasing student outcomes, college career readiness, but also, increasing the bottom line. And once a student's been, applied, admitted, and enrolled, that's a lot of time and effort that goes into doing that, to have the student only be there for one semester and not be a successful completer, and to possibly be a stop out or a stay out. And we're just kind of not talking about persistence today, but there is also, students do go to other states, and we can, we could go down that road. So let me just go quick back to the presentation. In interest of time, I'm over, so I'm sorry. Okay, so Carolyn, we're back to the main screen again with the takeaways. And so let's hand this back to Carolyn, because from a business perspective, and that's what we're talking about, really, what are the benefits to the business, to the organization?
Well, to the point of, it's interesting because 80% of the poll is to this point, the proactive student management approach. I'm going to call it today the Jasmine effect, just for that today, the opportunity for better outcomes, a better human approach. This is the power of analytics, truly. But then rethinking the outcomes and the failures. There are more of those stories, unfortunately, I have than I do have of Jasmine. I just remember the Jasmine stories more, which we can look at, the why. Ultimately, when you start the benefit of identifying characteristics of students that are at risk, why? That's where you can dig into the modeling and the data to figure out what that looks like. And you might be validated, you might be right, but I have a feeling we're not, because we're moving at a 2 to 5% increase. So, and today isn't about what that is, because we don't have that answer. Aaron and I don't have that answer. If we did, we would share that publicly, clearly. We would give you that information so we could all make a huge impact today. But it's in the details of the data. Something maybe that alerts the staff when there's a focus on retention efforts that may already be there, but typically what I found, it's always reactive when a student doesn't return back to a semester, or their attendance drops by the 3rd week, or add drop date. That's always like a critical, like everybody's all hands on deck around add drop dates. Also looking at the benefit of identifying characteristics that most highly correlate to that particular cohort success. I know we've all seen particular cohorts do very well. Why? And replicate that. And you can do that in general education studies as long as those students, and I think in the more human and emotional intelligence side, if they have a clear vision on what that end result looks like. And that's the process up front. So knowing that data of what those characteristics of those types of students in general studies, undeclared majors, those are all huge red flags. They're having that at-risk approach, proactive approach, those details can help you in ongoing efforts to identify those students and particular programs. 65% of the jobs in the future for our children coming into high school don't exist yet. So that's an interesting fact too.
And just to add to that, 95 million jobs are going to be obsolete in the future as the world changes. So, we didn't touch upon that. We really are talking about first-time entry, freshmen, identifying that. But really, there's another population that's coming in as well. There's that older population that's returning to school who may also be first-time entry, late matriculation. And there's going to be different aspects of their education and their choices that need to be looked at separately from, a 17 to 19-year-old, as opposed to someone who's in their 20s or 30s looking to either change the career or update their skill set to be competitive in today's economy.
Very true, Aaron. And it's not I find that the rules that is intuition-driven, that it can adapt as data changes. So keep measuring what moves and seeing what moves up front because how we act and behave today based on the data outcomes we discover are not going to be the same approaches in a year from now, 2 years from now, 2 years from
And
now.
that's extremely important, Carolyn, that you said that. And when I was in Washington, when Dr. Jack Buckley was running the National Center for Education Statistics, and we were bringing these data together and we were proposing these integrated systems, one of the things he told us is, with great power comes great responsibility. If you're bringing these data together, understand that you can be creating false correlations. You may be chasing your tail on something that is not an issue, and there's some things you just politically don't want to get into. I mean, there's issues, and as I brought up race and I brought up some of the demographic characteristics, but that's not what we're going to focus on. We're not going to focus on a student's race. We're going to focus on the other aspects that make those students successful. So, it's kind of getting away from that, But there is a danger. There is a danger, and that's one of the things that it's important here on that last. As you improve outcomes, predictions won't be based on old conditions, and so these models need to be constantly revisited, tested, and refined, and that's part of the analytics process and statistical analysis of those data. So, with that,
yes, absolutely. So, we haven't spoken about CCG. So, with that, I just wanted to give a thank you and we focus on value and partnership. We're people-oriented. We're all onshore. We're all no outsourced. We're well-rounded and experienced in the education sector in many different technologies. We know this isn't easy stuff. We have experts in everything from Canvas, Campus View to PeopleSoft, you name it, and processes. Our processes are unique and can help leverage your best ways. So utilize Aaron, myself as a resource. If you start these different approaches and you just say, hey, am I on the right track here? Ping us, email us, call us. We are open to help you get where you need to be. It's a community approach. CCGers, we are passionate about our enterprise information management and student success. We're problem solvers and innovators, and we challenge you to do the same. We're leaders in our industry. We partner based on assessment, vision, and roadmaps to help implement unique roadmaps to each school to sustain the momentum as a trusted advisor over time. At the end of the day, CCG, we understand colleges and schools' needs, and we want to help you figure out the easiest, most economical and effective outcome for you, your students, and to positively impact your community. We encourage you to continue to explore advanced analytics, and that can help you with better student outcomes. With that said, I'd like to open it up for questions. We have a few minutes. The chat box is going to be available. Aaron, I'm going to say, we're often asked where this data is collected from, internally and externally.
It's a great question. So in the past, that could have been a difficult question to ask because it would come from many systems. I mean, today with iPads, institutions are already collecting these data from their financial aid systems, from their application systems, academics, but they're pulling these data together 3 times a year. There's 3 submissions, a fall and a winter spring iPad submission, where these data are brought together, they're aggregated, and they're provided to NCES, to iPads. And so this data is being collected, it's being provided to the feds. I showed some very good visualizations that the National Center has been able to build, a couple we've been able to put together ourselves with publicly available data. And the one thing that always fascinated me was I know that these aggregates, the details are there. You have them within your systems. So in the course of collecting and aggregating the data, you're really building the data set you need, or one of the data sets you need. So it's not just a give. I think sometimes when we're requested to provide data, we just check the box and we provide the data, but we don't really understand how those data are being used and how we can use those data. It's just it's something that we're doing to satisfy a need, but if we can gain value locally from that, it's extremely important.
Right. Okay, so we have a few questions. We're getting for the attribute, Aaron, for the attributes listed in
Yes.
one of the slides for the data model, can all of them be obtained from iPads is the first question part. Or did it require access to supplemental data from other systems like their SIS?
Yes. Yeah, so everything I showed today, all of the visualizations that I showed you today are built strictly off the public data sets. Now, keeping in mind that if you want to drill deeper, as Carolyn said, we want to drill deeper into these students. We need to look at academic performance. We need to look at warnings and probations. We need to look at GPAs. We need to look at a lot of information that is really kind of PII or FERPA protected. So that really has to come from your individual SIS system. But the iPad submission has guided you in that direction. So really, I showed you the high level, but you have the drill through, the detail from there. And those can be integrated and can be brought together. And there's an organization, and I skipped over it, but I have worked with PESC, the P20 Education Standards Council, and they are actively working with a number of universities across the country, educational thought leaders, to identify, define those elements, put a weighting on those elements, security on those elements, and most of them are coming from your SIS. I mean, if you've got a Banner, for example, Banner system, most of that can come from Banner. In other organizations, you may have differing levels of integration. That's a service that we provide as well. We help bring those data together and integrate them. And I think in the past we've talked about data warehousing, but the term data lake, where we bring this data together and we work with the data in a kind of a less structured and integrated to be able to develop those models. And then once we've found what we want, we really go after those elements. So it allows more time for discovery.
Right. And just for the sake of time, I wanted to make sure we clarified this question. Knowing iPads as a standard and helps benchmark against other universities, is it true having more real-time data could help how they are at multiple points over time and not wait until the survey cycle to finish to see their stats?
Absolutely. That's exactly what we did in the K-12 world when we worked with the Eden EdFact submissions. So working with submissions that were tied to government programs, we realized that reporting to the government at the end of the year, and if we under-reported students, we wouldn't be reimbursed for those programs. So the offices that I worked with said, let's look at this proactively rather than reactively. So when we submit this, we've done everything we can to make this the best data, the best view possible. And that goes back to the analytics. If you identify that you've got that retention, it's in an area, you can create a model that identifies those students, proactively apply resources and programs, and then when you report your iPads data, you're reporting the best data based on your programs and based on your ability to serve your student population.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Please feel free to reach out to Aaron or myself. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to leave you today with one final thought. The next time you pass a freshman on your campus, know that 2 out of 6 of these folks will drop and not return to college. Using data to innovate new approaches is key to their success and to move the needle in retention. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, everyone.